Hello, welcome to Oxford Heirlooms. In this video, we're going to be working on the back of the day gown. And what we're going to do today is we're going to sew the front seam along the back, and then we will create the placket at the upper part of the back part. Okay, now I've got a little blue mark where my seam is supposed to begin and where my placket will end. And I've got the gown pinned together. Got my machine set for a straight stitch. Let me see if I can zoom in over here. See if I can adjust my camera a little bit where it actually points on the sewing machine. Okay. All right, now I'm going to start at my little blue dot, and I'll go forward and backward a couple of stitches, and I'm going to sew a 1/8 inch seam allowance on the back of the gown. Just go backward and forward a couple of stitches just to tack it into place. Take your pins out as you come to them. Okay, you clip my threads. Clip the thread up here. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I need to go to the ironing board and press this seam to one side. But before I can do that, I'm going to clip to the top of the seam that I just sewed. Okay, now let me go to the ironing board and press my seam to one side. Okay, so I've got that seam pressed to one side, and since this is Imperial Batiste, I went ahead and pressed the seam flat. Now up here where I was sewing before, I'm going to go back and forward again and then make a tiny little front seam at about 3/16 of an inch. Now I can see the fabric of the first seam through the batiste, so I'm just sewing very close to to the edge of the seam, close to the edge of the seam. That way the new French seam will be as small as possible. About 3/16 of an inch, I guess. And when I get down to the bottom, I'll go forward and backward a little bit just to hold that seam into place. There we go. Okay, now I need to go to the ironing board one more time and do a couple of things. Number one, I need to press the seam toward one side. Okay, and then I need to press the folds for the placket so that I can come back and hand sew it. Now, once again, I'm going to clip to my seam, but not any farther than my seam. So let me go to the ironing board and I'll press my placket open and press my seam to one side. Okay, I've got my seam pressed to one side and I have created my placket and pinned it into place. Now what I did on the placket was I took the seam and I folded it in by 1/8 of an inch, and then I folded it again by another 3/16 of an inch. Let me take that pin out. Okay, so now what I'm doing with the needle and thread, I'm sewing some tiny little whip stitches just to hold the placket into place. Now when I get down to the bottom of the placket, I will miter the bottom, and I'll show you that in a minute. But let me do these tiny little stitches, and then I'll be back in a minute when I show you the miter. Okay, I've gotten down to the bottom of the seam, or close to the bottom of the seam. So what I'm going to do with my needle is I'm going to take this little corner and I'm going to push it up under and inside so that it folds at a little diagonal. Then I will continue with my tiny little stitches and simply sew that little diagonal corner into place. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of little stitches right here at the top of the seam so that I can do the same sort of thing on the bottom of the other side of the placket and just carry my thread through. Now from the other side, I'll need to take my pin out for a minute. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bottom of that placket and I'm going to fold it inside. Just use my needle to fold it in at an angle. And then I'll do a couple of tiny stitches to hold that fold into place. There we go. And that makes a nice bottom to our placket. Okay, so let me continue back up to the top of the dagon on this side. And then I'll go to the ironing board and give my placket a little bit of a press, and we'll move on. Okay, that gets our back seam done, and we have a nice little placket opening for the neck hole in the back. Now in the next video, we'll sew some gathering threads along the top of the neck hole opening and prepare to sew on the neckband. But in this video, we were creating the French seam along the back of the day gown and creating the placket. Thank you.